Good afternoon, and welcome to Industry Needs by the Borough, the state of the Bronx. My name is Jose Ortiz Jr., and I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. It's great to be here with you all. Thank you to all the members and partners that have joined us this afternoon. A special thank you to Amazon, Google, Verizon, and Bonsai Bank for sponsoring this series. NYC ETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYC ETC's membership is composed of 190 workforce providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to over 600,000 New Yorkers. Today, in this third installment in our four-part Industry Needs by the Borough series, we'll discuss the state of the Bronx and strategize on measures being undertaken to keep businesses open and workers employed. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from a great panel of leaders that represent business interests in the Bronx. All participants should know that you'll be muted for the duration of this webinar. I'll moderate a discussion with our speakers and discuss the state of their communities and what else can be done to keep businesses open and get the Bronx workers employed. Before we start, we'll first hear brief remarks from one of our sponsors, Bonsai Bank. Bonsai Bank has earned a reputation for financially servicing the needs of an underbanked neighborhood since 1960. They emphasize the importance of personal banking, creating generational wealth, and promoting local economic development. Bonsai Bank is the largest FDIC-certified Hispanic-led bank east of Mississippi, the #1 Hispanic minority depository institution, and one of the largest community development financial institutions in the country. Today, Bonsai Bank maintains 13 branches throughout New York City and Union City, New Jersey. We'll now hear from Carlos Nadon, President and Chief Executive Officer of Bonsai Bank. Carlos?
Thank you, Jose. I think that the video has to be started by the host. Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Appreciate the introduction, and welcome, of course, to the New York City Industry Needs, the state of the Bronx. We know that the city has been impacted by COVID and all of the different consequences of that, but we do know that different boroughs have been impacted differently, and I do want to focus on the Bronx. I do want to thank the New York City Employment Training Coalition for organizing this great event to advise the communities, stakeholders, and all the boroughs on issues and topics the disadvantaged folks are experiencing on a daily basis. The mission of this event is really well aligned with Bonsai Bank because it impacts all of the same communities we serve. I did want to take the time today from our usual day of board meetings to make some remarks because of the importance that this holds to us. So I do want to also thank the panelists and the sponsors, other sponsors for this event. I do hope that the information that we share today will help keep the businesses' doors open and workers employed. I do want to recognize Madeline Marquez, our Senior Vice President of External Affairs, for her leadership in this area, and I can assure you that she and Bonsai Bank will fully support the initiatives that will develop from this. So I do want to spend just briefly a little bit of time on the pandemic, but because as we know, the pandemic did not impact all New Yorkers equally. It certainly disproportionately affected African-American, Hispanic, and Asian communities. And the Bronx, for example, had the highest hospitalization and death rates. Unemployment in the Bronx peaked at nearly 25% in May of last year, the highest rate among all of the boroughs. By June of 2020, the Bronx had lost about 45,000 private sector jobs, which was an 18% decline compared to the same period a year earlier.
Yes.
The pandemic really exposed the vulnerabilities of our communities, what they face today, and has renewed the commitment that Bonsai Bank has to them. We were funded, as Jose said, 61 years ago, but when I joined the banking industry in the 1970s, there were 11 banks in the Bronx. At that time, they totaled around $20 billion in assets, and they were employing almost 5,000 people. Today, there are 2 banks in the Bronx. We are the largest, and we are at 1.7 billion, and we are employing 250 people. So that gives you an idea of some of the job losses in just the banking community. And the reason that the bank was created 60 years ago is in 1960 is because of the exodus of other banks from the Bronx and the exodus that actually repeated itself in other boroughs. I will also say that in battling COVID, we spent about $1.2 million in additional costs. But those were costs that we were very comfortable making because we were able to keep all our branches open throughout the height of COVID-19. And as you know, many banks permanently closed branches in all the boroughs. I can say that from January of 2020 to May of 2021, over 84% of the bank's lending dollars have been invested in New York City. We averaged about $720 million of investments, which for a $1.5 billion bank, that's a very sizable number. Since 2020, we funded over 5,000 PPP loans, about $250 million, and we provided technical assistance to all of those owners. We are continuing that process today through the forgiveness phase of the PPP program, and we are embarked in our own program to essentially follow the PPP loans. We call it the Prosper program, geared to micro businesses and their financing needs. Our goal is to aid small businesses in maintaining their operations and grow their net worth, which will counteract the increasing economic distresses that are being faced by our communities, in particular the Bronx. We understand the lack of financial wealth in our communities, so we are transitioning our platforms and we have gone virtual, aiding families to continue building financial security on the comfort of their homes. We have hosted over 100 educational workshops, seminars, and we have created something we call Bonsai University, which we're using electronic platforms to equip the public with the knowledge and the skills to make the pertinent financial decisions. Many in the industry talk about financial literacy. We prefer to talk about financial mastery. When you're literate, you have a fourth grade education. And we believe that our communities deserve more than a fourth grade education in financial matters. And to accomplish all this, we have partnered with many folks that are here today, as well as entities, local nonprofits, schools, and businesses that are very helpful in getting the word out to the communities of what needs to be done. I want to indicate some of the accomplishments that the bank has had in this area, but it's really, I don't want to do it necessarily to blow our own horn, but to make sure that people understand that if we had more banks and more financial commitments in the boroughs and in the city, we would have the much greater economic impact. As I said before, there are 2 banks in the Bronx. There used to be about 11, and that's a great impact. So I will say that the bank is a community development financial institution, as well as a minority depository institution. There are 168 CDFI in the country. In New York City, there are probably 25, 30 banks. We were one of the 100 corporate organizations in the city to be judged the most socially responsible. Among CDFIs, the 168 that I mentioned, we are the #1 in the country in terms of commitment to housing. Housing is a critical element in New York City, particularly affordable housing. We are the 10th largest in terms of size of assets, and we are the 5th largest in terms of having branches in low to moderate income neighborhoods. The 13 branches that we have, all but 2 are in low to moderate income neighborhoods, areas that are, we like to say, underserved, but not underserving. And so, it is in noting that if there are more financial service providers, it would be better employment, local employment in particular, in New York City. So I do want to also acknowledge that the bank could not have achieved what it has achieved and grown the way it has grown without having the community support. And I think that folks are beginning to understand that when you deposit $1 at Bonsai, 84 cents of that dollar will come back and be reinvested in the community. Many other institutions, unfortunately, export dollars outside of the communities. So I want to, again, thank you for the opportunity to give some remarks and understand that we fully support all of the efforts that are being made in this regard. And again, you will pardon my having to depart to go back to our board meeting, but rest assured that some of our folks, including Madeline Marquez, are participating all day in this program. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, the opportunity.
Thank you, Carlos, and Bonsai Bank, and all for all that you do with the community. And thank you to all our supporters. Before we get started with our panel, we'll hear from Lena Moe, the Assistant Director for the COVID-19 Recovery Project at the New School Center for New York City Affairs, who will provide a labor update on the borough of the Bronx. Lena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose. Hello, my name is Lena Moe, and I'm an economic and policy analyst at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School. Could I have the next slide, please? Today, I'm going to talk about the COVID economic impact on New York City and the Bronx in particular, focusing both on how COVID has affected jobs and how it should be considered a depression-level event, very different from a normal business cycle downturn. I'll then turn to the workers who are affected and finally offer some thoughts about the trajectory New York City is on to recover, which we argue will require a substantial city investment in workforce development. Next slide. Here we see the broad parameters of the economic impact on New York City. You can see New York City is the gray line, much steeper than the US overall in the initial plunge, but similar to New York State. This is because New York City saw the initial surge in COVID, and also because New York officials responded strongly to the initial outbreak with business closures and lockdowns, which triggered a downturn that was steeper than the US overall, with a 20% employment decline in New York City in the first 2 months, compared to about 13% in the US overall. Since then, if you track the months across the bottom, you can see that we saw a fairly rapid early recovery last summer and early fall. But this then plateaued, and there was no further employment rebound between October and February 2021. Then from February through June 2021, there was a resumption of a rebound. And in this period, New York City's rebound was proportionally in line with the rest of the US. However, since June, there has been basically no private sector net job growth overall in July and August. So in August, we saw about an 11% increase, but in July, there was a decrease. So at this point, the recovery has slowed down also at the national level. And I want to leave this slide by emphasizing that here we are 18 months after the onset of COVID, and we are only partly recovered, with the US down 2.7%, and New York City down 10.1% from employment prior to the pandemic, more than 3.5 times the national level. Next slide, please. So this slide is very core to our analysis of job loss in New York City, and it is very number rich, but we will distribute this for your use after the presentation. So first, in our analysis at the New School, we have divided industries into 3 broad categories: essential work, including healthcare and government; remote working categories, including many white-collar and higher income jobs that could be done from home; and then lastly, face-to-face industries, where employment losses were concentrated. So in hotels and restaurants, the arts, transportation and warehousing, and retail, among others. COVID has had a very different impact on each of these categories of work. and the most severe and sustained job loss was concentrated in the face-to-face industries. Essential workers kept their jobs, but were exposed to greater risk. Remote workers were better paid to start with and saw less employment decline. People by and large were able to keep their jobs and their benefits, and most of these were salary workers also, as compared to face-to-face workers who tend to be hourly workers, not getting paid unless they go to work, and most of them didn't have a remote work option. So this slide is updated through August, and the key column I want you to focus on here is the percent change from February 2020 to August of 2021, showing the impact of COVID to date. Overall, the city's economy is down 10.1%, as I said, but face-to-face workers are down 19% as a group. Remote working, by contrast, is down less than 5%, and essential industry workers are down less than 2%. And if you look at the very last column on this chart, which shows the percent of jobs since the initial lockdowns in April 2020 that have been recouped, overall for the city, there has been a 49% job recoup. For private sector workers, 47%, and for face-to-face workers, 46%, which is in line with the city overall. But remember, this is where the steepest job decline was in this category, which you can see in the middle column of the absolute numbers of job loss from February 2020 to August 2021. So citywide, we are down 473,000 jobs. And in the face-to-face industries, we are still down 391,000 jobs. So the face-to-face industries most heavily impacted, I've shaded here in gray, with retail down 47,000, food service down 93,000, and so on. This is both where the big job losses are concentrated and where the concern is. Again, there are a lot of numbers here, so I encourage you to return to this chart. But moving on for now to the next slide. This is still using payroll employment data to look at 3 months. So pre-pandemic, February 2020, September 2020, about 6 months into COVID's impact, at which point there has been some rebound, and then March 2021, which is the latest period for which we have the data needed to show the borough level employment. There's about a 5-month lag on those data. This chart also shows the percent decline and percent recovery in private industries for the city overall and for the Bronx. Note, the way to read this is that there was a 16% decline from pre-pandemic levels, and then the rebound is measured relative to that extent of decline. So there was a 12% recovery relative to the initial decline. Or in the Bronx, there were 6,000 jobs recovered relative to the 26,000 jobs lost between February and September. So when we compare the city with a 16% decline to the Bronx with a 10% decline, this reflects that the hardest hit sectors were hospitality and arts, which had a disproportionate effect on Manhattan. Manhattan accounts for 3/4 of job losses in the city because it has which is greater than its proportion of employment. And that's because job losses were so concentrated in those face-to-face industries. However, this story gets flipped when we consider who the workers were who lost these jobs and where they live. And I'll turn to that in a minute. But sticking with the payroll data for a minute, in the Bronx, some of the industries that lost the most jobs included education, social, and health services. The Bronx lost almost 10,000 jobs, followed by trade, transportation, and utilities, 7,000 jobs. And this slide, again, you might want to return to see more detail about the particular industry job loss. Next slide, please. Before we leave the payroll employment data, you can see here the proportionate difference with job losses concentrated in Manhattan and relatively less in the boroughs. The Bronx here is in green. But I want to say that from this slide, it might seem that the Bronx was not that hard hit. But keep in mind, 10% is a depression level decline. 2% is a normal cycle downturn. 5% is steep. 10% is a depression level event. Next slide, please. This shifts to look at who the workers are who were affected citywide. So this compares different demographic groups to the average person and their likelihood of losing jobs. So people with high school education or less were 23% more likely than the average worker to be dislocated, whereas people with a 4-year degree were 20% less likely to be dislocated. The same goes when you compare young adults to those who are 55 plus. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the earnings profile. So the earnings levels show the wages of workers. Workers making less than $40,000 a year in annual salary were 18% more likely to lose their job than the average worker, while those making $100,000 or more were 34% less likely to be dislocated. Next slide, please. This slide shows how we came to estimate the number of Bronx workers impacted by industry. So we don't have the precise number of how many Bronx workers were dislocated, but we have the citywide job loss, and we also have census data showing the demographics of workers in the Bronx. And combining these two sources, we estimate that 61% of Bronx workers work in face-to-face industries, which were the hardest hit industries, implying that the Bronx was very hard hit. Next slide, please. And this slide shows in further detail the demographics of the workers in each of these 3 broad industry categories. So one thing to note here is that 90% of Bronx residents working in face-to-face industries are persons of color. 82% of Bronx workers in face-to-face industries have less than a 4-year degree, and 3/4 earn less than $40,000 a year. So again, this is looking at the face-to-face industries, which were the worst affected, and shows the demographics of those who are most likely to be impacted. So at this point, I am nearly out of time, but we've looked overall at the city level job losses and at the Bronx level job losses, as well as the workers who are affected by those at both the city level and the borough level. And again, I will circulate these with some more information about our ideas about some of the questions that we've heard. Next slide, please. So some questions right now in a very unsettled labor market are, why have we heard about labor shortages despite there being high levels of unemployment? First, this is a hard question to answer in an unsettled labor market that is seeing very uneven rebound. But we believe it has a lot to do with a lack of childcare and the problems connecting long-term unemployed workers to new jobs. Next slide, please. We know that long-term unemployment, being defined as being unemployed for more than 26 weeks, is a very difficult problem and tends to stick with a worker for a long time, affecting mental health, family structures, how well workers' children do in school. And right now, I just want to offer this top line statistic, which is that 23% of New York City's unemployed have been without a job for more than a year. This is going to be a very serious problem. Next slide, please. I want to conclude with one slide about the months to recovery, and then I will distribute the longer slide deck. So here is a glimpse into the future. This shows the predictions about the number of months to full recovery, which, as we see, the Independent Budget Office thinks will be around 2024. This slide shows the net job change on a 4th quarter to 4th quarter rolling basis. The blue bar shows the job decline, and the orange bar shows the net change relative to the pre-pandemic levels. So here we are, closing in at the end of 2021, and the IBO projects we will still be 351,000 jobs short of where we were prior to the pandemic. And it will not be until 2024 that we achieve and go beyond pre-pandemic employment levels. So the IBO predicts that we will get back 264,000 jobs by the end of this year. If you go back and look at the core data slide I shared with you, right now we are at 252,000 jobs right now, but there were only 11,000 jobs added in August. So it's possible that the IBO estimate won't be too far off. I will leave it here. Next slide, please. Here is a list of our most recent reports at the Center for New York City Affairs, and I will point out in particular the hospitality report as being particularly relevant to those hardest hit during COVID. And as I said, we will share this deck. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lena. That was really helpful and incredibly sobering. So we appreciate your perspective. And thank you, as always, to you and all our friends at the Center for New York City Affairs. I'll now take a moment to introduce our speakers, who are an incredible group of leaders leading innovative work in the business community. First up is Marlene Cintron, President of the Bronx Overall Economic Development Corporation, Lisa Sorin, President of the Bronx Chamber of Commerce, Dr. Edward Summers, President and CEO of the Thinkubator, and last but not least, Jennifer Tausig, Director of the Community and Economic Development Preservation Corporation at Montefiore Health System and former Executive Director at the New York City Bid Association. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. So I want you guys to just take a quick moment to just introduce your work a little bit more, so that we can provide everyone who's joining us today with a little bit more color. Marlene, do you mind going first?
Let me unmute here. I'm Marlene Cintron, President of the Bronx Overall Economic Development Corporation. BOEDC is the holistic economic development corporation of the Bronx. We provide a myriad of services. Predominantly, we are lenders of below market rate funds, so we are able to lend funds to small businesses to the tune of about $7,000, although we hate to do that because it's too little for the same amount of paper, up to about $5.5 million for the acquisition of commercial property, build out, and machinery. We're also major advocates with the City of New York, Department of Buildings, Sanitation, continue to provide hindrances to further small businesses in our community, and everything in between. So soup to nuts, we're there for our people. I have the Bronx Tourism Corporation underneath me, and also underneath BOEDC is the SBA 504 lender, where we can lend from $200,000 up to $5.5 million to help the slightly larger businesses anywhere in New York State. And so we're here for business. We're here to rebrand the borough. I think we've done that pretty well, but certainly we bleed Bronx like everybody else on this panel.
Thanks, Marlene. Lisa?
Tough act to follow, Marlene. Lisa Sorin, President of the Bronx Chamber of Commerce. I have the privilege of representing what I hope is the 27,000 businesses across the borough, somewhat in support of what Marlene does. We have used the last year and a half, 18 months to really walk the streets and figure out door to door, face to face about the issues that are facing our businesses, where they've been mostly impacted, similar to what Lena said, and what type of resources may be available for us to help them to provide that. We've been very lucky to be able to touch over 3,000 businesses just since October, many more since this whole pandemic started. And it's really full gamut from technology to assisting them to find loans, just figuring out their marketing and reaching out. A lot of them, the technology divide in the Bronx is huge. It's something that came to the forefront in the year that we've been walking. So that's been a priority for us in figuring out how to bring technology to them and helping them out. And there's a whole array, but I will not bore you. I always say, visit our website. There's a lot of information there, and we're here to help, just like Marlene.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Eddie?
Hey everyone, Eddie Summers here. I serve as the president and CEO of the Thinkubator, which is formerly the Bronx Private Industry Council. We are an innovation and workforce organization. We're focused on educating and training young people aged 14 to 24 for the workplace. So we provide a number of internship experiences and work-based learning experiences. We connect directly with employers to figure out what they're looking for and try to construct programs to meet the needs of employers. Over this past year, we've been very focused on not only supporting young people in terms of just work-based learning, but holistically. So all of our internship experiences this year were paid. They were paid by the Thinkubator because of some of the burdens that was placed on business during this past year. So we are very focused on how do we, just like Marlene said, bleed the Bronx, right? And really support the Bronx in its holistic form. So we just actually announced, with the support of Robinhood, a program called our Job Corps program, which is a recovery corps program focused on really just connecting young people to, and not so young people to, the opportunities that exist in the Bronx now. So very excited about this opportunity to support the recovery of the Bronx.
Thanks, Eddie. And Jen?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Pardon my voice, I'm recovering from an illness. But my name is Jennifer Tausig. I'm the Executive Director of Mosholu Preservation Corporation. I wear a lot of hats. And the Executive Director of the Jerome Gun Hill Business Improvement District, and the Director of Community and Economic Development at Montefiore, which is the largest employer in the Bronx and the largest healthcare provider in the Bronx. Montefiore created MPC back in the 80s. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary to really help combat the community deterioration in the neighborhood where our main campus, the Moses campus, is. We've evolved over the years, of course, but we now have essentially 4 pillars of work that that address some of the social determinants of health. So our goal really is to create healthier conditions in the neighborhoods where we work. And so we do that through quality, affordable housing, small business support, neighborhood development, and the local news through the Norwood News. So as you can imagine, a lot of our work over the last 18 months has been focused on our small business support work. So in addition to the Jerome Gun Hill bid, we work with 2 local merchant associations near our Montefiore properties in Wakefield and Norwood Bedford Park. And I just finished up a term as co-chair of the New York City Bid Association, which is where all 76 bids gather together and do policy and advocacy for issues that affect all of our neighborhoods.
Thanks, Jenna. Thank you all. So let's jump into it. We all heard Lena's update, which was really sobering, as I mentioned before. Obviously, the impact of COVID on businesses, and not obviously, you start with the impact of COVID and the health concerns across all the boroughs, including the Bronx, was pretty dire. But obviously, the economic impact on the Bronx is pretty sobering. So what's your immediate reaction to her update? And anyone, feel free to start.
If I can unmute myself, I think I'll start. First of all, her presentation was amazing, but I want to add a caveat to it because the issue of unemployment is a big deal. You can't have unemployment and economic development. It doesn't happen. You've got to have people who are working, and that enhances economic development. So when I got here in 2010, our unemployment rate was about 14.2%, but she focused on the jobs lost on the island of Manhattan. And those numbers I do not dispute, but certainly the people who lost those face-to-face jobs, the people who wash the dishes, the servers, the person who says hello at the front of the restaurant, the people who work in the hotels, they can't afford to live in Manhattan. So the numbers are a little skewed. And so I downloaded the unemployment rate information from the New York State Department of Labor. And I was very proud of the fact that in January of last year, we had gone down from 14.2% to 5.3%, the lowest it has ever been in the history of New York State unemployment statistics. And February went down even further to 5.1. But in April of last year, it was at 18.5%. And in May, it was at 24.6%. So this is the real number for people who actually put their head on a pillow in the Bronx, even though they may work in Manhattan. And so our situation is even more dire than what she had presented. And it's heartbreaking that the borough of the Bronx is majority women, head of households with children. And so it was a tsunami with respect to those that were working or no longer working because the schools were closed. They could not, take their kids to school. The daycares were closed. There was no opportunity for women head of households, who are the majority of the Bronx residents, to be able to even defend themselves. And so certainly Hunts Point market is in a good year, an $11 billion industry. In a bad year, it's about a $9 billion industry. And they have about 9,000 workers of all kinds in the Hunts Point market. One company, when the governor closed, the state was owed $50 million in receivables. In all businesses, you drop stuff off and then you get paid 30 days later. All right. And what they do is that they drop off, produce and meat and whatever, to the hotels and to the restaurants. And, there was never a problem with them paying. Another company, a larger company with a lot more workers, on that day was owed $200 million. And so we're not talking about small potatoes here. And one of those companies held their workers until August of last year because he thought that this pandemic was going to be short term and he couldn't afford to lose these workers. At that particular point, he started weaning off. And now he finds himself in dire need of workers, and we can discuss the shortage later on. But certainly jobs lost, service, hotels, restaurant, retail, maybe in Manhattan, but they lived in the Bronx. And nonprofits, a lot of nonprofits lost contracts and the opportunity to vie for additional funds with some of the trusts. And so that is another area that, although that was the case, nonprofits did an amazing job day to day, facing, handing out foods in the streets, doing whatever they could in order to ensure that the Bronx remained standing. So amazing presentation. I just think it's even worse for the Bronx.
Thanks, Marlene. Lisa, or Eddie or Jen, feel free to jump in.
So I'll jump in here for a second. Marlene is correct, right? So I think this is multi-layered. One is I'll address I'm sorry, lost my train of thought here. The tech divide, let's start there. So one of the biggest concerns that we had as it relates to businesses that lost their employees was the fact that, almost 85%, give or take, and Marlene can correct me, of businesses within the Bronx are mom and pop, or what we call micro businesses. And so because that's the case, you tend to do business old school. So when this pandemic happened and everybody had to turn to technology, now became, where do you have access to broadband and internet service? And or how do you use it to sustain your business for these face-to-face restaurants that never did deliveries for whatever reason, now found themselves either completely closed or last minute trying to figure out how they can use technology to continue their business. So, we are trying to address that issue by working with programs, open and online, and other resources that we've been able to capture. But I find that the biggest areas of concern remain in commercial corridors that do not have any type of leadership. And by that, I mean a business improvement district or a merchant association or somebody who heads and has a voice on their behalf. So we have had to put people on the ground to really have these one-on-one conversations. Add to that the language barriers and the understanding of cultures, right? Because even if we're offering the assistance, various cultures are not open to the resources from general chambers or whatever the case may be. As it relates to workers, it's become a little more difficult. The vaccine is an issue because I think the Bronx falls second to, after Staten Island, the lowest vaccinated. You have individuals who are choosing not to go back for safety reasons, whether they are vaccinated and afraid of catching it again, or not vaccinated, not believing in the standard that's set forth. So what do we do with those? We have found that entrepreneurs are coming forward. Interestingly enough, a lot of home-based businesses are calling for help those are the tech savvy ones, right? But we are trying to sustain the ones that are here. And how do we find the employees to reestablish, to bring back employees into the hospitality industry where it's being mostly felt, retail, super felt. Again, anything that is face-to-face, like Lena was saying, is still very hard. Does that fall on the fact that the vaccine is an issue? Lack of communication, education, access, it can't be access anymore. That's off the table, personal opinion. And then it's retraining the mindset of what the people that are unemployed, why are they unemployed? Because we're getting calls on a constant basis of businesses begging for employees. Oh, how does that relate to the unemployment? That's a conversation to be had. You know, right now as a chamber and with partners, we can address what we know for sure. And what we know for sure is we need to keep the doors open to the businesses that are here. We need to figure out a way to get the employees back in, and we need to encourage vaccination. The vaccination becomes a bigger conversation because restaurants are saying with this new mandate of vaccination, they are yet again having to either release their workers because the workers refuse to get vaccinated, and now they're mandated. They have it, or they don't have enough workers that are vaccinated to be able to continue normal working hours, right? So there's all these levels of conversation to be had. As a chamber, we can address the face-to-face, but I think collaboratively, this what you see here and the partners who are listening in, it's what exactly is the need of our businesses so that we can address that need and then close the gap with our employees, the men and women that are unemployed, to the jobs that are out there to put them to work. And then figure out how remote working is now a conversation, and assist to continue to push broadband and education on the importance of technology.
Thanks, Lisa. I want to let Jen and Eddie jump in here on this question if you have any comments before we move on to the next question.
I'll just jump in and quickly say something about youth, since my organization represents young people. Prior to the pandemic, youth unemployment in the Bronx was already about 24%. So you could imagine, Marlene talked about the devastating number of the Bronx in terms of just overall unemployment being 25%. So with the pandemic, if prior to the pandemic, youth unemployment was 24%, it's probably doubled. So we're probably about 50 to 60% of youth unemployment. So that's definitely a challenge that we're seeing in the Bronx. So to make the case even worse for the devastation and the impact that the pandemic's had on the Bronx. The other thing that I want to say is sort of we know that there's so many different industries in the Bronx that are calling for people to come back to work. I think that there is a disconnect between sort of what people view as good jobs and the jobs that exist in the Bronx. And I think that there needs to be a conversation amongst employers and then those of us who are providing training to really talk about this meaning of what are good jobs. I think that there are lots of jobs in the Hunts Point market, for instance, that you could make a good salary on and support your family on. But there is this perception that that might not be a good job, right? It's not that knowledge-based job. It's not that job that I can work from home, right? Like everybody else did during a pandemic. So I think that we need to sort of change the language in the lens of what are good jobs, because we do have sort of an economy that exists in the Bronx that's largely service, that's in the food service, that's in the retail, that all these sectors that were already mentioned, and we need to be able to best support those. So I think that there needs to be this back and forth conversation between the employer side, the workforce organizations, in terms of how we reimagine, how we talk about the economy in the Bronx, and how we inspire people to be able to go into these positions. So that's the one thing, two things that I want to add to this conversation.
Thanks, Eddie. Jen, did you want to add anything before we move on?
You could go ahead and move on.
Okay.
I know you.
And maybe you can start us off with the next question. Obviously we've heard a little bit about this, and I think, each one of you touched a little bit on this, but really how are businesses shifting their talent approach given the need for workers to come back? And in some cases, obviously this not being the case. And what trends in hiring practices have you noticed businesses shift to during this period of time?
Yeah, so I actually might let Marlene handle this one because she works with a lot of the larger employers. I work with a lot of micro businesses, similar to what Lisa was talking about, immigrant-owned mom and pop shops. And one of the things that we learned about them, and I think that they also sort of learned about themselves during the pandemic, was that they are so old school that they're not exactly set up for success in employment. A lot of them we learned are 1099s. So as we're trying to help them get access to the Paycheck Protection Program and all these other loans and grants that are available, taking a look at their books, it was sort of like, this is not going to fly. And so we've really helped them shift their thinking, and started them on some business planning with some professionals where they are finally willing to kind of make those changes as they've seen, the pandemic, that they got hit so hard and that there wasn't a lot of resources available for them. And so we're hopeful in that will open up more opportunities for employment, instead of saying like, I'm gonna have my cousin come help out, or my neighbor. And so really being able to do like very grassroots sort of economic development in our corridors to help strengthen the businesses and make sure that they can stay there, while also creating more opportunities for employment for the community. But I know that Marlene has some feedback on some of her.
I was just going to ask Marlene to jump in there.
Well, I'll start with Hunts Point. We had a press conference at the beginning of August. The market is hurting. There's hundreds of jobs available. And underscoring what Eddie said, there's a lot of great jobs there. First of all, they're looking for drivers. I'm talking to the state right now. Fact of the matter is that there is a nationwide shortage of CDL drivers. And those are union jobs. I think they start at $40 an hour. And the market is so desperate for people that they're offering anywhere from $250 to $5,000 as a sign-up bonus. They're offering medical coverage. Legally, they only have to cover the worker. The Hunts Point employers are offering to cover the complete family, in addition to 401ks, dental. So certainly they're putting their best foot forward, because they can't make money. They can't even begin to try and make what they've already lost unless they have workers. I had one of these employers was not able to send out 2 trucks of food that had been ordered. But I'm talking about these big trucks, because they didn't have enough workers to fill the truck up. So certainly there is a disconnect. And so when we did the press conference, what I did was that I made sure that Univision and Telemundo was there. And much to my surprise, ABC, Fox 5, all the major channels in addition to News 12 were there, because they understood even back then that there was a disconnect between businesses that were definitely up and running and wanted to really and truly do more. I don't know if you know, but 75% of the fruits and vegetables that are grown in California are consumed in New York. It's the Hunts Point market that makes a market on the majority of what's grown across the nation. So it's not just a Bronx issue or a New York State issue. It really, what we do here and what we don't do here really and truly impacts the economics of the complete nation. So certainly the smaller companies, we're doing whatever we can do in order to get people together, but certainly the issue is the disconnect. But the Spanish language, I gave them the list of the 400 jobs that were available by the 4 employers that participated in, and people started walking over. Sometimes it really is all about not knowing where the jobs are. And people started walking to Hunts Point that afternoon. And quite a number of people were employed in the subsequent weeks, but there's still a lot left. So definitely, we've got to figure that part out. The other side of the coin is, I think that part of what's happened is that the new economy and the new jobs is very different. Many nonprofits have figured out that people don't have to come to the office to be willing to work, able to work, and online in a way that still is very productive. So it's a new world out there. And if I can cost some of my employees less by not having to drive, not having to take a bus, risks, train, other COVID risks, and still be productive, I'm finally okay with it.
Yeah, and thanks, Marlene. I think that speaks to the productivity and in the job quality discussion that was raised earlier. I think there is a healthy balance between those two. But I do want to continue to press on the other strategies that are being undertaken as well, because I want to better understand not just the nonprofit sector, but more importantly, just also businesses in general, what they're doing on the ground in order to make sure that they have the talent that they need. And then we'll move into kind of discussion around kind of workforce training and some additional job quality questions that we might have. But Eddie, Lisa, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'll jump in quickly, and I think as was mentioned before, a lot of the Bronx businesses are 2/3 of them are small businesses. We have 20 businesses that are large employers that hire 1,000 or more. I think a lot of the strategies that we're seeing, and I think Jennifer really touched upon this, is that a lot of these businesses had to innovate. Quite frankly, during COVID-19, they've had to try to embrace technology when they didn't necessarily have to embrace technology before. I think that a lot of the strategies that we're seeing is that, unfortunately, because of the digital world, a lot of these employers saying, well, I don't necessarily need this person to come in my office. I could still hire them part-time as a 1099, and they can work from home. And so I think that those are some of the strategies. There's still a lot of unknown out there for employers. So to make a big leap to just hire, particularly for the small employers, is really tough in this climate right now. So I think a lot of them are trying to embrace the technology. We've seen just in our organization, when we work with employers, they tend to hire these young interns to work on their social media or update their websites to help enhance their businesses. So those are some of the techniques and strategies that they're doing just to stay alive. I think that for a lot of them, it's about survival versus, can I go out and hire 5 or 6 employees? No, I just need to stay alive. I need to pay the books this month. And so those are some of the things that I've really seen in working with a lot of employers. And then just, there's some movements out there. There's been a movement with bodegas, and there's this new app on bodegas. I can't remember the name of it, but there's been a lot of movements out there on how do you best embrace technology to support these very small businesses. And the bodega app is just one example of many things that innovators and entrepreneurs are coming up with to really support local businesses in the Bronx. And Lisa probably is seeing much more than I am.
Lisa, do you want to jump in before we wrap up this question?
Nope, I think they all said it all.
Okay.
Thank you, Eddie. I'm going to leave that one so that I can continue the conversation when you go into workforce development. Because
Sounds good.
I'll just say one quick thing, that gig work has become a much stronger thing now than it was before. And I think that's part of either the personal strategy or the businesses using gig workers.
Yeah, and I also want to just quickly mention the piece that's been resonating throughout this discussion around kind of technology, and that was an issue that resonated not just obviously with all businesses, but in nonprofits in general. Organizations had to adapt during this period of time in order to best serve their constituencies, and that adaptation required not just developing programs and developing technical tools, but really teaching people on the job on how to do this work well for the communities that they serve. And so it's comforting and sobering at the same time to hear that this was something that was happening across the board, not just in the nonprofit sector, but in businesses in general, and that we need to do a better job overall of ensuring that we adapt more readily and rapidly in order to do a better job to serve our communities. But as we go into this next and last question or set of questions, what practices have you noticed as a business adopt to enhance their relationship with workforce development providers? And just generally, what can we do better as workforce development organizations to not only enhance the relationship, but just do a better job in general delivering the talent that's currently required for small businesses, medium businesses, and large businesses alike?
I'll jump in here for a second. I believe that one of the biggest problems we have right now, to your answer, is the lack of communication or real in-depth conversation with businesses that are in need, individuals that are looking for a job, and what's the gap and what is the actual gap to close it, right? In the perfect world, yeah, in the perfect world, you have a borough-wide fair, right? Where you have businesses, or you do a borough-wide survey or something concrete that can, and surveys are great, but more face-to-face and more communication that what the businesses are looking for and what it would take for them to succeed when it comes to employees. What is that piece of the puzzle that we're missing, right? We can all assume to know what that is. I don't think, we can say it's training, but honestly, until there is some level of communication that targets, as Marlene or Jennifer said, or Eddie, that people don't know the jobs that are out there. Well, why don't they know that those jobs are out there, right? What communication are we lacking? Does that bring us back to the digital problem? The businesses, why aren't there more notifications, or where are they putting these want ads other than their front window or on to be able to capture it, right? So the truth is that if collectively there is something that can be put together borough-wide, right? Because there's a lot of us doing repetitive work. And if everybody were to come together for a week or whatever, that really allows everybody to say that what are their needs, what do we have, and what are we missing? Put those trainings into place. CDL, it's great, but what does that mean for somebody realistically? Is it just getting a license? Am I on the road all the time? Because I think of a CDL license and I'm saying, oh my God, I'm never going to be home. But is that really the case? You now have Amazon that gives you the small vans and you become your own worker, right? So your own employer. So there's a lot of communication and we're just all jumping in, trying to tape up the problem. But I think if we're really going to solve it, this forum is a great start. What you all are doing, what we're doing is a great start, but the conversation has to be bigger and it has to incorporate the different cultures that we're not addressing automatically out of our borough. Everybody works differently. Everybody relates to people differently. And I think we're missing that piece also as we're evolving.
Go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that, there is clearly some disconnect, right, between those who are providing training and the jobs that exist. And I think what we're seeing is that there are a lot of workforce organizations out there who are training young people to go into the knowledge economy. And that's okay, because that's what we wanted, right? We wanted our kids to do better than us, right? Like, so, but for the jobs that exist, who are those workforce organizations that are training and that are preparing, that are helping the local population prepare for those jobs that exist now, right? So like I think about, the work that Bronx Community College does in their Bronx Educational Opportunity Center, right? Like how are they connected to the employers? I do think of, and this conversation makes me reflect on what Marlene, the VP, and Here to Here did, what started in the Bronx Private Industry Council. I thought it was a great idea. I think that, but maybe our focus on young people were not the right connection for the types of employers that we have in the Bronx, right? So the Thinkubator is doing great with trying to train young people and getting them into college. We have like 90% of our students are going on to college, 10% went on to work or whatever. So we're doing good with like really developing that pipeline, but those young people will be young people going into the knowledge economy. So I think that the idea behind the pick should have been, now reflecting on it, 2-3 years later, maybe focusing on disconnected youth that dropped out of school, that are no longer engaged in school, maybe formerly incarcerated youth, maybe those young people who are 24 to 32, that are a little bit older, that may be interested in these particular jobs, and inspiring in that population to think about these open opportunities. So perhaps, we need to begin or reopen that conversation around what we've talked about before with the VP, Marlene, and Here to Hear about the Bronx Private Industry Council, and like really making sure that we think about the population that we're working with and making sure that it connects to those open opportunities. Because that was the original intent of the pick, but we were working with younger high school students. And Marlene told me in the beginning, like, you're about education, you're about educating and training them. And that truly was that. And so more and more, I think we need to open up, and thanks for bringing it up, Lisa, that dialogue between all of us to make sure that we're able to connect people to these job opportunities.
And we're running really low on time. So I'm going to ask you both, Marlene and Jen, if you want to add something, just take a minute or so before we wrap up.
Yeah, we have to focus on what the jobs are. And so certainly, as I've indicated before, you have to talk to the employer and say, what do you want? And more importantly, first of all, what do you need? And then what do you want? Okay. And so I had mentioned the trucking thing simply because those are existing jobs that are right now there. And when I spoke to an employer just 2 days ago, I asked him, what else do you need? And he says, Marlene, sales. Sales is going online. You know, people can do this from their house, but I need them to sell meat for me online to the supermarkets. I mean, whatever the case may be. The other thing is that 1 out of 4 people who work in the Bronx work for Montefiore Hospital. And we talk about technology. Fact of the matter is that so much of what Monty does right now in the hospital uses technology. So, you know, radiography, you know, sonograms, MRIs, those things are jobs that pay very, very, very well. They're going to have a job for life because those jobs are going to continue to exist. So the name of the game is to look at the jobs and then train them to fit those jobs that are there. Forget it, and got nurses, we need nurses desperately, doctors, we need doctors desperately. So the jobs are there. Let's focus on training for those jobs.
Jen?
Yeah, and I'll just close out by saying, you know, I think it would be helpful for folks to connect with your local either business improvement district or merchant association. You know, a lot of us have really deep connections with very small businesses that are always looking for help, whether it's part-time or full-time, and sometimes have like sort of informal job boards. But we're always, you know, as we're doing outreach, connecting with our businesses, and if they need help here and there, we're trying to connect them with people from community-based organizations. So it's very micro, it's very, you know, neighborhood kind of level. We're always looking to bring in people from the neighborhood too. So connecting with those kinds of organizations that work with really closely with small businesses could be helpful to sort of penetrate in the small business world, because I think that that's a lot harder than a larger place like Montefiore.
Thank you. And I really wish we had more time, but we reached the conclusion of our panel discussion. Really, thank you all, Marlene, Lisa, Eddie, and Jen. Thank you so much for sharing your diverse expertise and perspectives with our members and partners today. Really appreciate you taking the time. And obviously, as it was mentioned, it's important that we have more regular non-siloed discussions about this particular issue. That's how we're going to address this very large challenge and serve the constituents of the Bronx and the rest of the city in the most effective way that we can.